Welcome to the HR Dialogues, a podcast where we explore the world of HR and how that is impacting the future of work. I'm your host, Dr. Veldsman. In today's episode, we'll be speaking to Alison Lands, and we'll be exploring the skills-based landscape and what skills-based organizations are going to look like in the future. Join me in this episode as we also uncover how you can identify your own skill sets to drive your career and set yourself up for success. Welcome to the HR Dialogues, where we learn from people practitioners as they navigate the emerging world of work. Alison, great to have you with us.
Dita, thank you so much. It's great to be here.
Alison, introduce yourself to our audience. Who are you? What gets you up in the morning? What are you passionate about?
Well, for everyone on the podcast, I'm Alison Lands. I lead strategy at a company called Skyhive Technologies. My background, what gets me up in the morning, I think you could definitely say that skills is my passion. It's been my passion for quite some time, long before it was sort of the hot topic in HR, workforce development, or any other place. And the reason for that is because my background has largely been in the workforce and economic development sectors for my entire working life. I was really fortunate to luck into my dream career and vocation with my very first job out of college. It was coincidental, but I also feel like it was a little bit fated because starting in that first job in local government and working to help underemployed people get better jobs and have access to economic mobility, that put us very closely in touch with the needs of employers. It really started me on a path that I'm quite fortunate has stayed not only relevant, but has continued to evolve and is actually moving to the forefront of the discussions that we're having about the future of work and learning. So anyway, if I get too excited, you can rein me back in on the podcast, but I'm definitely a champion for skills. And at Skyhive Technologies, it's one of the emerging skills intelligence platforms where we are using advanced AI and machine learning methods to cognify the global labor market and to use disaggregated skills data in novel ways. So I think it's definitely something where we're working with Fortune 500 and Global 2000 employers all over the world, but we're also working with educators in post-secondary, community colleges, VET and CTE programs, as well as workforce development organizations. So this is a topic that crosses sectors, industries, geographies. As I like to say, the future of work is everyone's business. And I'm very happy to be here to discuss that business with you today.
No, that's great. Thanks so much, Alison. And I think that kind of sets the tone very nicely for the conversation pertaining to skills-based ecosystems and skills-based organizations. I think, as you've mentioned, and anybody that is interested in the people domain or in the organizational design or architecture domain, the topic of skills have become even more relevant today than it was 5 or 10 or 15 years ago. I think what we are trying to see at the moment is how does that play out practically? In my experience, and you and I have been speaking about that offline, everybody buys into the skills agenda. What they struggle with is how do I get there and what does that mean? Now, I want to take us back and I'm going to start with a very simple question to you to say, help us define the skills landscape. When we talk about skills and skills-based organizations, what are we talking about?
Sure. And I'm glad to hear that everyone is on board with the skills agenda. That was certainly not the case even as recently as 5 years ago. And I would work with policymakers, presidential candidates, consulting clients. And after they heard the word skills several times, or they would see research where we had, synthesized across various disciplines the need for skills-based practice, the question would inevitably come, is it really all about skills? And there was a skepticism there that I think is not as prevalent anymore. And I think folks are on board. So I'm assured about that. For those who aren't, when we think about, what a skills-based strategy might look like, or why are we hearing so much about this right now? It's been a long time coming. A recent blog post I wrote, we talked about sort of in the past, we've operated largely off of a jobs and occupation based paradigm where we're using job titles, job descriptions, occupational categories, infrastructure that was largely created at the turn of the 20th century. It was part of the industrialization of our economy. And those practices have largely been in place and we continue to operate to them to this day. The challenge is that in the intervening century, we've had several economic evolutions that have dramatically changed the way that we work, from going from primarily agricultural or agrarian economies to industrialized economies to assembly line, production, and then moving into the introduction of advanced technology and digital technology, where we started to become a digital economy and now more of a knowledge economy. As this is happening, our infrastructure largely has not changed, our skills or our learning or our educational and HR infrastructures. And as a result, we're now rubbing up against a point where we're hitting a point of friction where machine intelligence and automation are really starting to replace large components of work. They may not be eradicating jobs entirely, but they're fundamentally changing them, and they're eroding parts that used to be done by humans and replacing them with machine intelligence. And that's requiring us to rethink how we think about work, how we think about who does what work, and how we can adjust and adapt so that as jobs change, we're able to change with technology, and to not allow, necessarily, we don't want underemployment. We don't want mass unemployment. We do want agile methods to be resilient in the face of this change. And I think skills-based strategy is part of how we're going to get to that place.
I want to deep dive into one or two points that you've mentioned, because I think a first very important point to talk about is, in the past, I think people have utilized words such as work, job title, job role, description, almost in the same bucket of talking about the same thing. And I think what we are realizing with these shifts that we're seeing between the different industrial revolutions, the new season that we are going into, Industry 4.0, 5.0, etc., is really this notion that what the work is, where the work gets done, and how the work is approached is actually not the same thing. And, I think we can see that in new experiments around the world that people are also having with regards to saying, why is it a 5-day work week? Why not a 4-day work week? Why does everybody have to be in the same location? Why does everybody have to be in the same time zone? And I think that plays a little bit into our conversation pertaining to skills as, what is it really that is required in order to get the job done or to get or achieve that particular outcome? I want to ask you a question, Alison, because, I get a lot of feedback from people when we talk about skills. Then out of the old, very traditional organizational design type of thinking, they would say, but no, a person can't be diluted down to only being a particular skill. How do you respond to that? Because I think it doesn't contradict necessarily with meaningful work, but there is a middle way, and I would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Absolutely. I'll cite sort of a recent newsletter I was reading. It's a higher ed newsletter, so it may not be one that this audience reads deeply, but it's published by a guy named Ryan Craig at Achieve Partners. And he wrote an op-ed in his recent newsletter called "Skills-Based Hiring is Like Pornography," which also for folks who are outside of the United States is referencing a 1964 U.S. Supreme Court decision that related to decency in media. And it coined the term, "You know it when you see it." So everyone has a different sort of perception or a subjective opinion about what is or is not pornographic, but you know it when you see it. It was sort of the distillation of what came out of this case. And I thought that was a clever nod, one, to sort of the subjectivity of how people perceive something like skills-based practice, and also how the emergence of a new paradigm like skills-based practice can actually, create a lot of different versions of what is this and what does it mean. Especially as it's sort of entering these concepts of skills as currency or skills-based practices. They're emerging and getting maturity in, the HR zeitgeist and across corporate enterprise. They're not going to have a fixed definition. So, we know that work and purpose are actually extremely important, not only to just the performance of work and the health of organizations, but the well-being of individuals and their ability to adapt and remain sort of resilient in the face of some of these big changes. I mean, if work has been largely predictable and, there's been sort of a path that you've followed throughout your career, and that has now been disrupted. In some cases, I'm not glad that the pandemic happened, but there have been a lot of silver linings for work that have fallen out of it. And in some ways, they have the potential to really benefit humanity. And in other ways, they are challenging long-held orthodoxies about work and how people should be in the workplace and how they should prepare, for their careers and how they should operate their careers. And I think that's going to take definitely some adjustment. When I think about skills-based practice, I really believe that we should avoid getting hung up on any semantics or trying to correlate one-to-one the concepts of skills-based practice with concepts of organizational design or other HR frameworks.
Yeah.
I think that tends to get us hung up. And in some ways, it's such a new discipline and it's evolving in and of itself from a definition perspective that makes it, we might get hung up on the conversation about what it means and actually less about how to do it or how to do it well or what parts will work for us and those we'll take forward. But I can say with certainty that one of the big focal points of it has been skills-based hiring, and skills-based practice goes well beyond just that skills-based hiring and introducing, less bias into our talent acquisition processes and hiring more equitably and thinking about skills versus proxies for skill or qualifications. It is really, I think, in my perspective, more of a mindset shift. So embracing notions of skill that go beyond historical proxies. So for a long time, we used degrees, majors, where you went to school and the prestige of the university, previous job titles and whether you'd held them before or not. And we used all of those to signify ability. But skills-based practice, rather than reducing people to an amalgamation of skills, is really more about looking towards skills as a common denominator that can be used more objectively and more flexibly than our current status quo, which was largely developed in many cases by committee, in some cases by bureaucracy, where a group that was in power agreed upon what an occupation would be or what a job classification would be. And then we all operated to that standard. I think external to all of us as a profession, as a discipline, as the workforce, that is being changed. It's just being changed by disruptive technology, by creative destruction, and we're having to adjust to it. And we're trying to use the vernacular and the parlance of our 20th century HR frameworks. It's not always serving us well. And that's why I think you can see thought leaders really starting to try to reach into other areas of practice, cross-disciplinary, interdisciplinary concepts to try to bring more of that into how we think about skills so that we aren't just trying to be reductionist or potentially limiting to people by just talking about them in terms of their skill.
And I think it's an important point for HR practitioners there, because I agree with you. I think the frame of reference needs to change in terms of how we approach skills-based practice as opposed to seeing it an evolution of something that we already have. And I think that's very much to your point. That's where people get hung up a little bit around, but where does this fit in my taxonomy that I have? How does this relate to the existing competency frameworks that I have, etc.? Whereas I really believe that there's a lot of good opportunity, and I think if managed well. Loved your point on skills-based careers, because I personally believe that will be the future for people to say, what can I do? Where can I go and apply it in the best possible way? And where am I going to find meaning out of that particular relationship? Somebody mentioned to me the other day, and I think it relates to our conversation, to say, don't tell me you're funny, tell me a joke, and I can evaluate that for myself. And I think that's very relatable in, this context about moving away from the proxies and actually utilizing a lot more of an evidence and a data-driven approach that is a lot more fair, a lot more equitable, and also a lot more inclusive. I think about what talent really wants and how talent changes. I want to ask you a question, Alison, because I think it's got some very interesting implications for the employer-employee relationship. And I'm a very firm supporter of, I think some of the newer, call them talent models that we are starting to see that's more focused on mobility, more focused on point in time, purpose, etc. How can an organization apply a skills-based thinking framework towards, general HR practices that we have today? Where do you see the biggest impact?
I think, at least it may vary depending on sector or function or even regional geography. And so I can speak, primarily from the US context. Skills-based practice in some ways is it's becoming a non-negotiable. For reasons of our structural labor market, there simply is not enough skilled talent that matches the ways we've thought historically about talent to hire into the open vacancies. And so we're starting to see persistent open vacancies, loss of productivity. We're seeing, wage inflation in the form of fighting over, across industries and across, geos and companies all enterprises are essentially fighting for the same 4 or 5 digital skill sets, which are largely undersupplied in the labor market. And so it's an untenable situation. And I think on some level, there's a silver lining in there, which is that employers are starting to become more of the long pole in the tent of the workforce ecosystem. Previously, they had looked to the education system to turn out turnkey, well-prepared candidates that they could hire through their recruiting mechanisms, or they looked to the workforce development system to retrain workers who had been displaced or lost their jobs due to a plant closure or automation or some kind of disruptive change to an industry. And they're realizing that those two arms of the ecosystem alone can't meet the need that they have for skilled labor. And so they're starting to lean in more, which I think is a wonderful practice. So the areas where I see probably the most promise would be in the form of talent acquisition, which is, say, starting to look at skills as a way to get beyond proxies or pedigree and hire more equitably and more diverse candidates into roles, ones that are skilled to do the work. And we're seeing in the US, the relaxation of degree requirements and job descriptions. Yes. And we're also seeing government particularly leading that charge, which I think is, I'm really heartened as a person who comes from the public sector by background and also feels really strongly that government can be an engine of economic mobility and training and can reinforce democratic norms by allowing more people to serve as part of the civil service and to experience the delivery of government firsthand, as part of their work. This is really promising to me. And for talent acquisition in the corporate sector, I think this will also result in giving more opportunities to skilled, qualified candidates to come in and then to grow within an organization. So if talent acquisition is where I'm seeing the tip of the spear, because it's one of the most exigent pain points for companies right now, the next step, and you can see organizations in the US like Guild Education, InStride and others, then they start to have the conversation about, once you've got diverse talent in the door, how do you make sure that you're able to retain it and cultivate it and actually move it to a higher level of, like, if you're using frameworks, the like employee lifetime value? How can we get them up to speed and ramp them quickly into their roles so they can be successful? And then how can we give them multiple pathways within this enterprise in which to navigate a career so that they can see there's a place for me here. I have growth potential here. This is a wonderful place for me to stay, for the longer term, and they will invest in me accordingly. And the second area of promise beyond talent acquisition, I think, that I've seen over the past few years, and I come to this role at Skyhive from a previous role in skills transformation at Coursera. So L&D and internal upskilling across the enterprise. So for non-traditional hires, for some of the STARS candidates that we're starting to see, those folks who are skilled through alternative routes to a college degree, they have applied experience and skills, but we want to continue to invest and upskill in them. I think learning and development is a really promising area for skills-based practice. It can both have the effect for enterprises of helping cut through some of the content chaos and clutter of many learning assets, and it can deliver a more personalized learning experience for the individual that is aligned with the needs of the company, but also aligned with the needs of the larger labor market. And I think when I talk about employers being the long pole in the tent of workforce development, I see so much potential here for the companies that lead with skills-based practice to not only meet their own needs and be really successful and differentiated in the market to have a competitive advantage, but also to start to lead a larger, structural change in the way that we govern our careers and in the way that we skill for life. At least in the United States, once you complete high school or once you complete college and you throw your mortarboard in the air, you're done. And there's a small segment of the population that continues with adult professional education and continuing education, but it's not the norm. And in this world without jobs, work without jobs, or this world of a knowledge economy, it's a continual need. And I think we can go a long way with skills-based practice to starting to create that cultural groundswell within our jobs and within companies.
And I think there's also because I definitely agree with the immediate kind of, hot potato, I think, is talent acquisition due to labor shortages. I'm extremely interested to see how it plays out, and you referenced it in terms of the internal mobility within organizations, because I still believe, and this is just my experience, as much as you promote internal mobility, talent is not mobile in the structures that we bed down in terms of how an organization operates and functions. There's just too many barriers towards talent actually becoming mobile and being able to be redeployed, upskill themselves into something different, etc. And I often feel, career management has been the little forgotten brother in the corner where everybody just talks about talent management as this big thing, but nobody actually talks about, individual choice-driven career navigation, because I think it is becoming a journey that employees will navigate within an organization across disciplines, across different experiences that they want to collect, across different challenges that they want to face and be exposed to. So I think there's some real opportunity there, almost in the mobility space, touching then on L&D, touching then a little bit on workforce skills planning in the organization and what that's going to look like, as well as then influencing, I believe, the way that we think about employee value propositions, employee experiences, because that's going to be a very natural evolution of building this machine internally that's able to go and utilize the best skill set available to solve the biggest challenges in the moment and in the time. And I think it's quite exciting if you think about your career in that way, and not get caught up in this narrative, which I think is a stumbling block pertaining to, tech is coming, my skill is no longer relevant. I sometimes look at some of these reports, and you typically get the list of skills growing and then you get the list of skill sets declining. I sometimes struggle with that, because I think the narrative should be a little bit more focused on how do I continuously, as you've mentioned, we've always spoken about learning organizations, but how do I continuously have this mindset of consumption of what's new, consumption of what is now relevant and what's going to take me, almost to that next. And Alison, I want to bring it down to something practical. So let's start talking about how does an organization shift towards a skills-based approach. And we've mentioned a couple of things already, but what I hear from a lot of HR practitioners is they get caught up in the details. Everybody buys the strategy, everybody buys the approach, but then when they ask them, okay, now get started, a lot of people struggle. How do I go about this as an organization?
Absolutely. And I think, we pointed to talent acquisition being the tip of the spear. It's the thing that hurts the most right now. So if that's what gets us started and it alleviates that or mitigates that, I can't say we'll alleviate the pain entirely, but if it mitigates the pain, then that's a wonderful, that would be a great outcome that would stimulate a deeper investment into skills-based practice. The challenge is that by and large, our job architecture and what we've been using to recruit talent, to evaluate talent, to hire it in, is largely the product of a lot of, maybe generations of subjective, input. I'll give an example from myself. Yep. In a previous role, I was asked to find a copy of myself out in the labor market and hire it onto our team. And to write the job description. And so, I used the job description that I had applied to, and I adjusted it slightly for ways that I thought that the role had changed in the intervening year since I had joined the organization. And then it was passed around everyone on our global team, and they all got to weigh in on what they thought would make a good candidate for this role. And then it got posted. And we had many, many applicants. This was, sort of during the height of the pandemic, and folks were great resignationing and looking to join, cool skills first organizations. And yet we ended up hiring somebody who largely didn't really align to the job description anyway, and sort of met the cultural fit of the team. And they were a wonderful teammate, and they did a wonderful job. But we had sort of, not necessarily walked our talk, and I think, brought to the fore quite a bit of the job architecture issues that prevent us from having skills-based hiring, really meet the need. It's one thing to actually relax the degree requirement, and I think there are examples, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania in the United States, Maryland, Utah, and others that have they've done an examination of not just their open vacancies, but their entire occupational job architecture, and said which of these jobs actually requires a degree and which would suffice whether you had a degree or equivalent experience, and what might that equivalent experience look like. They've adjusted their job architecture accordingly, from entry-level frontline roles all the way up to director level and executive roles. And I think in doing so, they've not only opened up a vast majority vacancies that were previously inaccessible to the 2/3 of American workers who don't have degrees. They've also seen an uptick in the number of non-degreed candidates that they've hired who are performing, well in the organization. So I think it's sort of like eating your broccoli. Yeah. Everybody wants to be in shape for swimsuit season, and we all want to have, good looking abs, but eating broccoli and boiled chicken and going to the gym every day is boring and hard to stick with. Job architecture is similar because it's a rather tedious exercise that you're going to have to not just look at current open vacancies. That's a place you could start, but then looking at all of the job architecture and saying, okay, where have we erroneously introduced bias? Where are we copy and pasting job descriptions versus taking intelligence from the market about what are the generalized skills that this role requires for not just our organization, but perhaps across our sector, or perhaps for a cross-functional type of a role like a software engineer across many sectors. What is global labor market intelligence telling us about what is needed to do this job? And then what is the 80-20 or that Pareto optimal amount that we could get by with, knowing that we could upskill and train the remaining portion? I think that's one place to start. It is rather tedious, but garbage in, garbage out. If you don't do it, you'll never get to the sexier applications of skills-based practice. You'll be consistently hung up on the fact that you're evaluating, analyzing, and parsing some junky input. And that's a tough place to be. So I think just gaining awareness of where job architecture might be, I won't use the word broken, but where it might need some investment is a good place to start. And I also think trying to get a handle on what the skills are of your existing organization is a good place to start. So many enterprises invest significantly in HCM systems or in technology, HR technology that can support upskilling, and then they don't actually utilize the skills modules of this software. And I think, almost every organization comes up on performance review cycles at least twice a year. That's a wonderful window with which to introduce both job architecture, examinations, as well as skills identification. And to recognize, I think that this will not go perfectly. It's going to be a bumpy, assuming that we are going to analyze our job architecture and our skills footprints and come away saying, we've done pretty well. We've got excellent skills architecture already in place. It's unlikely, just because of all the things you and I described in the first half of the podcast. But there's definitely a people component, a process component, and a technology component to every solution. We've got the technologies that are evolving right now. They're maturing. The challenge is that we're trying to marry them with legacy processes, and in some cases, legacy data that we've created ourselves that's maybe got bias embedded in it, or it was created from a subjective process like the one I described for my own job description. And as such, we're sort of not utilizing what we've got to its fullest potential. And then there's this sort of third component, which is the people component. Skills-based practice, as I mentioned, it is a mindset shift. And so getting organizations, even within the different functions of HR, to start to adopt this mindset shift and to support the change management of the enterprise is a huge endeavor. And I think maybe it's one thing to put it out there and to have it be underpinning some of this job architecture process change and skills evaluation that I've talked about, but it's probably not the one that you can lead with. It's got to be an ever-present piece that's being continually reinforced throughout the process of why are we doing this? Here's what we're getting from this. Here's what we'll get if we do a good job. And then celebrating every tiny success along the way as feeding back into, this is why we're making these changes. I actually had on social media the other day, I got into a nice debate. There was a post from one of our partners at Accenture about the diminishing need for recruiters and talent acquisition professionals in HR and how they were suffering from layoffs. And yet there was a growing need for L&D professionals, less instructional design, but more about learning technology, curation of learning, how to personalize the learning experience and how to embed it, and really select the right assets for learning within the organization. And so I put out this provocative thought exercise question, which was to say, at this moment when we're all sort of looking at skills-based practice, might this be the moment where HR can, within itself, see how easy it really is to take talent acquisition folks who understand the sector, who understand the skills
Mm-hmm.
needed for the roles, who are actively involved in trying to source that talent, know how hard it is, and know what the climb would be for an underskilled applicant to be able to skill up into a role. How hard would it be to reposition them, given that very few of us are really that conversant in HR and learning tech to begin with? Could we
Yeah.
use like the 4 to 6 month reskilling timeline and try to position some of those folks very immediately, retain them within the organization, actually
Mm-hmm.
strengthen HR as a function? And this got some
I can
interesting
imagine you got a lot of
interesting
views on
pushback
that.
from people. Well, I mean, this is it's never going to be a good moment to experiment with this, but we're sort
I
of being
agree.
forced to. And the consensus was, yes, that would be great, but what we really need is executive support. It has to come, like the C-suite has to, bless this or encourage
Yeah.
this or motivate this. And I don't know if I fully agree with that, because I think that HR can lead and probably should be
Mm.
leading. It would be a wonderful thing for HR to be seen as the change agent at this really critical moment that matters. I do believe that workforce and HR are having this moment. And
Yeah.
whether we harness it to our own advantage or not is really up to us. It's
Mm.
there, the C-suite can be swayed if HR can show the
Yeah.
way.
I agree. I think there's also, a lot of people I speak to, they struggle with the fact that they want to get everything perfect before they delve into this approach. And my advice to them is usually, just get started. We will learn as we go along, base it on good sound principle, but it's not going to be perfect immediately. And, to your earlier point, let's be honest, a lot of organizations don't operate in perfect job architecture either. So I think there is this thing around just get started and get going with regards to at least adopting the approach and helping people understand. And that's something that I've found as well, helping people gain insight also in terms of, in myself, the skill sets that I have, what is transferable, what can I go and apply elsewhere? Because I think that self-insight, self-awareness component is going to be very, very important to almost tackle this from two avenues. The one is from the organizational perspective, let's create the environment. And then the other one is let's create that drive and that awareness and the ability for individuals to actually have this insight and then to be able to navigate and action, as part of what they want to look at. Love the fact that we're going to talk about the talent acquisition learning component. I love that. I think there is so much. We don't always value the importance of context. And what I mean by that is I think very often, and I've had this with teams that I've built over the years, I would rather go for somebody with context that understands the problem we are trying to solve and not necessarily the job that they need to do. And I think that is a little bit of a shift as well for organizations to start thinking about. Would love it if HR leads the way. I think we need to experiment because there's a lot of pressure on HR in any event to start rethinking our delivery models and how we show up in business. And I think skills is just a great example of an avenue we should pursue.
Particularly given the potential that it has for return on investment.
Mm,
If you're thinking about, I read an article the other day about the cost of a bad hire, and I posted out on this about this on LinkedIn. If the cost of a bad hire is 5 to 27 times the annual salary, and I think when surveyed, it was abysmal. I think 3/4
mm,
of employers felt that they had made the wrong hire or that they hadn't hired the optimal candidate for their most recent opening. Then that tells you there's an enormous amount of savings to be had. And there is a positive correlation between
mm,
organizations that adopt skills-based practice and their retention of candidates and their perception of hiring better quality candidates at a better, I guess, a more better from a cost containment or a cost management perspective
mm,
price point, rather than trying to go to the open market, source external candidates and pay a premium because we're all competing for the same very, very
yeah.
limited talent pool. If you're looking internally, how can I cultivate that candidate from my incumbent workforce, or how can I lean into maybe a candidate I might not have considered in the past but would now consider under skills-based practice? I think, I'm an economist by training. I have to say, by definition, you've expanded your supply, and you will probably
Mm,
experience, a corresponding shift in your price point. But I would love to see that kind of experiment. And I couldn't agree with you more about coming at it from both angles. When we work at Skyhive and we are working with end users,
mm,
learners, employees, candidates in the workforce system to complete a skills passport about themselves. We are querying them about their previous experience. We're using it to a baseline and first skills, but then we are prompting them for additional context about their formal and informal work experience and about their formal and informal education, because that actually imparts quite a bit of the skill that we have. And just the exercise of being asked about their skills, whether they're professionalized workers or whether they're, youth coming, through a workforce program, it's almost as though a light bulb goes on.
Yeah.
Wait, I have skills. These skills have value. I have more skills than I might otherwise have thought. Here's how my skills could transfer to other opportunities that exist in the labor market. Here's how I can better myself and get more economic and career mobility from an investment of my learning hours or my time. And that light bulb, when it goes on, I think for companies, you want that outcome, because it won't just be on HR or on the enterprise's shoulders to steer and navigate employees through the employee experience or through the career pathways, which are, themselves evolving in real time. It'll start becoming, more of that partnership between the employee expressing preference and understanding what the art of the possible might look like, and the company being able to accommodate it from a skills-based perspective, and having generally more labor mobility, I think is a good thing. And certainly expanding the pool of digital skills that are available across all functions, all disciplines, is going to help ease some of the pressure that we currently have, with extremely undersupplied skills.
It does bring me to two questions, Alison. I think the first one, or maybe two comments rather. The first one is around, I think, that self-insight that people can gather, I think it's life-giving. And one of the most, I believe that stories change the world, and I believe that narratives change the world. And I think a very useful exercise I've been through before is to do a career story that kind of identifies the skill sets, the experiences that you've had, and just unpack that for you, because I think we don't spend enough time reflecting on what has happened and how I can utilize that going before. So the sense-making process, I think, is going to be so important for people, in this context, to try and understand, what is it that I actually did? Very often you would ask somebody about a project or something, and they would think back and they would say, I really can't imagine we did that. That was actually very, very great. And I think that's going to be so important, in terms of helping people to understand that shift. The second point, and I want to deep dive into that a little bit in the time that we have remaining, is it does bring us to the point of data. And it does bring us towards the point of making evidence-based decisions pertaining to what skills are and what they look like. And I think not to fall into the trap of the past of assuming that certain components, leads towards something else. Because to a large extent, let's be honest, in job architecture, we've sometimes assumed that certain pre-qualifications would screen somebody out, or certain experiences, etc. So what's your approach towards data-based skills development?
Sure. And I'll preface this by saying, in the past 10 years, we've learned quite a lot about what data correlates to, or doesn't correlate to, performance, and what should or shouldn't be used as potential criteria for hiring. Google published a study back in, I believe, 2013 that really showed that all of the metrics that they had been using to evaluate candidates, GPAs, degrees, transcripts, et cetera, were largely, their head of people analytics sort of acknowledged that they were largely irrelevant. They didn't actually correlate to how people performed in the job 2-3 years in, et cetera. I think we're also starting to learn some of the limitations of performance evaluation and using some of that feedback, to guide people's careers. Given that we're ever more conscious about, potentially introducing bias or using subjective, information to affect change that will impact somebody's livelihood, their career, their income, their mobility, I really want to think about how we use data, not just to get down to the granular level of, say, a skill, but also to help people contextualize what's appropriate for folks who have had a similar background to me or a similar progression to me. What is the art of the possible looking ahead in terms of both ability to reskill into something that has a very high labor demand signal or a very high potential or demonstrated need in the marketplace, versus how do I express some intent or desire there so that I can not just everyone be, otherwise we'll all be recommended to be, data
Yeah.
scientists and software engineers. On some level, we all need to become part data scientist, part software engineer. Don't get me wrong. But in this case, what I'm hearing is a real desire from the marketplace for people to be able to not just understand their skills and to understand where their skills can take them, but also to really start to think about how to put their own imprimatur or their own desires and goals
Mm-hmm.
and aspirations into that mix so that as algorithms in skills intelligence platforms are helping you contextualize what are career pathways available to me, where could I go,
Mm.
what would be a good one that's going to be sustainable for the future, what courses or skills or learning experiences do I need to have in order to demonstrate readiness for that kind of a shift. They also want to be able to put their intent in there and say, well, here's what I'd like to do, or here are things
Mm.
I'm interested in, or here's what I feel gives me purpose, and use that as part of the navigational system as well. I'm not sure we're fully there yet, but I'm starting to
Mm.
see some promising signals from the marketplace. And of course, like this is these large language models, the introduction of generative
Yeah.
AI, you know, this is all new science. And so I think
Mm.
on some levels, you know, when we're working with partners at Skyhive, we're working with large organizations that understand the art of the possible and are looking to experiment. It's almost as if
Yeah.
large enterprises in some ways are adopting a bit of a startup mentality about how can we examine ourselves and how can we get value from the process, even if what we're learning in the initial stages is that we didn't know what we didn't know,
Mm.
or what we thought was going to be the hypothesis didn't turn out to be the hypothesis. How can we still glean value from the exercise, and how can we use that to continually improve as an organization? And
Mm.
they do tend to realize those types of gains, as well as the proper gains of being a more skills-based organization, being able to hire more diverse talent pools, being able to lower their costs of
Mm.
labor, all of the other sort of like hard metrics that we would want to look at to inform data
Mm.
driven decision making. There's a lot more that's maybe in the, I guess if you, in the parlance of economics, it's more of the indirect benefit or the imputed
Yeah.
benefit of skills based transformation. And I think those are things that have to really be, HR has to be the advocate and the evangelist for those things, because financial accounting is the first to throw them under the bus. And I think it's a penny wise, pound foolish kind of a trade off we don't need to be making.
No, I agree. I think, it does bring to mind a story. I worked with an insurance organization a couple of years back, and the question was on their financial advisor side, what makes a good financial advisor? Now, we can argue whether that's the right question or not. What was interesting for me there, when they deep dived into the actual skill sets and the behaviors and some of the critical success criteria, it was very, very different than what they had initially thought based on, the profile that was set up based on the observations that they did, etc. So I think to your point, there is this notion of asking the question, but what really does success look like? What is the work? I mean, I'm a very big supporter of the deconstructing work to really be able to understand what does it mean and what does it look like, and then putting that together, in a very different way, and for people to be able to utilize and understand and navigate that. I agree. I think big organizations, and this sometimes goes a little bit contradictory to what a lot of people mention around agility, etc., in big organizations. I think there's a great opportunity there for a big organization because you've got scale and you've got resource and you've got scope. And I think there's some great things there that we can look at. Alison, we're starting to wrap up, and I want to ask, as an HR professional, what advice would you give me in terms of starting out on a skills-based journey?
I think one, I'll make a book recommendation, which is Work Without Jobs, it was published, I believe, last year,
Mm.
by John Boudreau and Ravin Jesuthasan. It's a great book that can contextualize how work is disaggregating, and you can really start to think it might be a little bit abstract when we're talking about it, at the level of the podcast or on some of the things that we're posting out on social media, but really trying to understand like how this evolution is taking place and what it might mean, and then applying it to yourself. I think the
Mm-hmm.
easiest way to contextualize the skills paradigm is to really think about it in terms of, as you said, your career progression and your career journey,
Mm.
yourself in your current role, yourself in your current function. And if you're an HR leader, that will both yield, I think, some some ways to move forward or some ways to talk about it within the organization that will reflect how your organization currently thinks about work, job, skills, and it'll allow you to be sort of a credible advisor to the business. And at the same time, it'll surface some of those initial challenges that are going to have to be navigated as you tread in to something like job architecture, or as you tread in to learning and development applications of skills technology. And I think those are kind of two places where you could start, where you as a professional will inherently gain value from the exercise. You'll understand yourself better. You'll understand your own career progression better, but you'll also start to see ways to bring that value to the HR function and to the organization at large. And that, I think, is really, if nothing else, it's a great demonstration of leadership. And it's a way to, as an HR practitioner, really start to think about how you lead within the organization and help your function of HR get out of a position of being, order taking, or in some ways being subordinate to, some of the more short-term needs of the business. Human capital, there's a term that, in some cases is bread and butter, and in some cases is maybe, evolving to a different usage, but it is sort of the next area of value that hasn't fully been unlocked by enterprises. And it's one that crosses out of corporate enterprise and into workforce, government, society, education. And so I think to the extent that HR leaders can educate themselves on what's going on and look not only beyond the HR function in the business, but beyond the business into those other parts of the ecosystem. How do we play with our workforce development and educational ecosystems to source talent, to inform how talent is being educated, to be recruiting from diverse or non-traditional talent pools to make sure that displaced workers are quickly repositioned into the labor market? That's going to create that flywheel or that virtuous circle that I think will make the job of skills-based practice easier on everybody. And it will make it mutually reinforcing. We'll start to see compounding returns to scale as more of those parts of the ecosystem get engaged. But it starts with us, right?
Yeah.
So
no, I love the idea as well. Something we talk a lot about at AIHR is, HR for good and HR beyond borders, because I think one of the limiting mindset paradigms at the moment is, that HR exists for the organization within which it resides, which I don't believe, is the whole truth. I think there is a contribution to be made towards broader labor market, societal challenges that we face, etc., because those things need to be solved between the partnerships that we will create between organizations and public sector, and then the education sector as well. And I think there's some real opportunity to find a common purpose and a common language through a skills lens, and to be able to do that. Alison, I can't believe we're already at this point of the podcast. It was really fantastic. And a couple of things that stood out for me really in our conversation that I hope is useful for the listeners is, the first one is that the skills-based revolution is here and something to be excited about. It's not something to fear. I think the second component for HR, we need to lead the way, but it requires a mindset shift for us in terms of how we approach some of our traditional practice, and we need to open up a little bit more. It starts with us, as you've mentioned. Take that first step, try to understand your own skill set and what that's going to look like. And I think the last big thing for me is, don't get caught up on the small stuff. Let's rather start focusing on how do we get this done and how do we get the ball rolling, as opposed to getting stuck in some of our old patterns and in some of our old ways. Alison, from my side, a very big thank you. And thank you for sharing your wisdom and your insight. Where can people find you if they want to connect or they want to find out more about the work that you and Skyhive do?
Absolutely. Well, you can certainly, if you want to learn more about Skyhive, you can visit our website, skyhive.ai, learn more about the work that we do with enterprises, but also as a B Corporation, learn more about the work that we're doing globally across the workforce ecosystem. If you want to learn more about sort of the work we're doing in skills-based practice or skills-based hiring in a very case kind of, real world example. Tech Nation in Canada is a good example, who's using Skyhive technology to grow their in-demand digital industries. And in the US, Opportunity at Work, which works with the 70 million skilled through alternative routes candidates who are trying to break into industry. We have partnered with them on their hiring platform of StellarWorks. It's gotten a lot of media attention recently. We're really excited about it. I'm here in Austin to attend South by Southwest to talk more about it and to celebrate it. And then if you want to follow me on LinkedIn, That is the only social media that I'm on, so please follow me there. And I post daily, and each week on Wednesdays I post out an assortment of the coolest jobs for the workforce. And by that, I mean the larger extended community of people who work on future of work, workforce skills, ed tech, and education. So if you're interested in seeing what others across our ecosystem focus on, or if you're interested in career mobility yourself, that's a great place to check it out, Wednesdays in my feed.
Perfect. Alison, from my side, thank you very, very much. Look forward to also follow you and see the work that you are doing and how you're leading the skills-based practice into the future. All the best, and we'll catch up soon.
Thank you, Dieter. It was wonderful to be here. Love the podcast.